Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is Toby Forman, CEO of SmartCIC. Toby joined me on the show mostly to talk about Cellsmart, which is a division of SmartCIC that is entirely focused on fixed wireless access. And through this, he is able to provide a global perspective on the development of fixed wireless access and its potential as a disruptive technology in the enterprise connectivity space. We start out getting a solid definition of fixed wireless in the market today, and I was interested to learn about how 4G is still relevant and may even become more so for enterprise connectivity as consumers move off of 4G networks and onto 5G. Toby explained the process of what Cellsmart does for service providers and enterprises that are interested in deploying fixed wireless access. And he got into all of the factors that one should consider in this process. As regular listeners know, I always get excited when we can bring geography into the conversation. And this was a particularly on-point interview for that. Toby's team at Cellsmart are currently undertaking a mapping process, which I will let him describe in detail in the interview. But they're going to show how well mobile providers perform around the world and give a visual as well as actionable guide to wireless performance at specific geographies. As I often like to get to in my interviews, Toby offered some real-world use cases to explain why and how fixed wireless access were actually a viable alternative to wireline for some of their real customers. And finally, we get into how Toby sees the fixed wireless access and wireless markets in general developing over the next few years, with a focus on enterprise connectivity, but also getting a bit into the broader implications of broadband access for all people for economic development around the world. I definitely came away from this conversation not only with a deeper understanding of the development of fixed wireless access, but also how to best evaluate and understand what is coming in that market and how best to put it to use. I think you will find it useful on these and other points, so enjoy. Welcome to the show, Toby.
Hi, nice to see you, Greg.
All right, thanks so much for being here. We always start out the show, Toby, with just a brief background on yourself and what you do as the CEO of SmartCIC. And today we're talking mostly about your division of Cellsmart.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm the CEO of SmartCIC. We're a managed global services provider. We provide connectivity solutions and field services through the line. And back in, I guess, end of 2021, beginning of 2022, we wanted to create a specific brand around fixed wireless access. So our business is really about being smart CSE and Cellsmart, and around the intelligence that you need in order to deploy fixed wireless. So we created Cellsmart. So that's our cellular intelligence division. And yeah, that's why I'm on the show today, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you about it.
Yeah, exactly. That's what brings us together here is to talk about the developments of the fixed wireless access market. Say we do some research of multinational enterprises network teams at Telegeography, and one of the things we ask is about what kind of connectivity services they're using at offices around the world. And definitely wireless is there. It seems to be a pretty small part of the mix still compared to wireline services. Does beat satellite, just for the record, by a fair bit, right? But yeah, we talk to the network managers a lot as part of this survey, and one of the things I always say is that I really would like to have more fixed wireless access options, because it can very often be sort of much easier to acquire in certain situations and things like that, shortening provisioning times. But first, before we get into, I think, the nitty gritty of making those options available to customers, I want to focus in on define fixed wireless access. So what are you talking about when you talk about fixed wireless?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think certainly in the sort of the telco world, there is a there's a potential to confuse fixed wireless access with point-to-point microwave or WiMAX type services that were available in the goodness knows about 10, 15 years ago.
Legacy technology. Yeah.
Legacy services. Fixed wireless for us is really harnessing the performance of publicly available cellular networks and using that as a broadband replacement service. And I say broadband replacement because the performance of those networks is simply not there yet to compete with DIA.
Right.
I actually believe that will happen over time. And certainly we're seeing that type of performance around the world. But yeah, we're talking about broadband replacement. So your XDSL, your FTTX type replacement service. From a use case point of view is great if you've got, retail units, small branch locations. So this isn't a solution that's necessarily ready for large corporate locations.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It has a place. But, I definitely see the demand for that, like I said. And you bring up a good case, retail, for example. I've talked to the network manager of a large, clothing retailer that's often stuck in malls. And malls, as many people know, will have a single broadband provider under contract, and you can only use them while you go to get, sort of SD-WAN, and you need multiple underlay connections. Then wireless is really the best option. So I think, like I said, I see a lot of demand out there for that. But it's been a matter of do they have plans that they can consume in a way that is like wireline? What's your sort of take on that in terms of being able to have a similar consumption and contract and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's not. So, I mean, there are definitely providers out there that say you can have all you can eat packages.
Right.
But our experience in practice is that after a certain amount of data consumption, that those packages are shaped, right? The traffic is shaped, the connections are throttled. So it's not there yet. And there's a very good reason why it's not there yet. The backhaul networks are not set up to cope with the amount of throughput that you would need if everybody moved from wireline services to wireless services.
Right.
That doesn't mean that you can't use that connectivity. You just have to be more disciplined about how you consume the data. And it's about having conversations with your customer. It's about understanding the use case and then building a package that works with that use case. I mean, we can provide, with the contracts that we have with some of our carriers, packages up to 1 terabyte. So there's plenty of data to be consumed. But I think I would say over the past maybe 6-7 years, we've all become very complacent about the amount of data we can consume and the amount of bandwidth that's available. And when you're using a wireless service, you have to think about that. It's no different to the way in which you think about data consumption if you're using an LEO service or a traditional satellite service. So you need to use that. The great thing, and you mentioned it before, is that fixed wireless access generally is outperforming those type of services from a speed and from a latency perspective.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So it's just a matter of kind of right-sizing the network.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned that you're working mostly with service providers rather than the enterprises directly. Is that the case?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we have a mix of customers, but the majority of our customers are carriers.
So it's a matter of the carriers kind of working with the customer to manage the expectations, to understand how this can be consumed and how they should ultimately sort of work it into their network planning.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the relationships that we have with carriers, they're very transparent about us in front of their customers. So we're actually having those conversations direct with enterprise because we can help facilitate those discussions. But it's right. It is really about trying to right size the circuit. But you have those conversations anyway. If you're looking at SD-WAN, you're having those conversations. Do you need broadband circuits or do you need a DIA? What is the use case? It's just you're putting something else into the mix that allows you to be disruptive if you want to be, certainly agile and very flexible. So the real value drivers that sit around fixed wireless access really come from speed to monetization. Wireline services take weeks to install.
Right.
unless something's lit, and it can be lit very quickly. But that's
Mhm.
generally not the case.
Right.
The benefit of a fixed wireless service is you can be in days.
Yeah.
So if you're selling to your customer an overlay service like SD-WAN, you can't monetize that investment, and your customer can't get the benefit of the overlay service they bought until you have the underlay that goes under that connects everything together.
Mhm.
So instead of waiting weeks for that underlay, you can use fixed wireless access. You can monetize that investment. Your customer's going to get the benefit within days.
Right.
So we already have a delivery mechanism, and our customers do as our competitors do as well. And
Right.
I'm on today to talk about fixed wireless access, not how SmartCIC
Right.
can do it. This
Mhm.
is about trying to build the category, if you like, of this type of connectivity. But if you've got a delivery mechanism, you can deliver incredibly quickly. We can deliver anywhere in Europe in 48 hours. We can deliver
Mhm.
anywhere in North America in 5 working days.
Right.
So that allows you to be incredibly dynamic.
Mhm.
And it takes the pressure off customers expecting delivery on wireline services. If you can bring up that service and migrate it over on something like fixed wireless, and then you can lift and shift and move it to somewhere else. And
Right.
we're seeing and we're working in projects where that is happening.
It's really interesting. I think this is why it's a great topic for the podcast, and why these enterprises that I often talk to are thinking about this. You have carriers really going all in on the sort of network as a service thing, bandwidth on demand, which is really cool. But when you're talking about end to end, if your provisioning time is weeks rather than days, the bandwidth on demand doesn't have the same real
Yeah.
promise that it should, right? So.
No, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so I want to talk specifically about 5G, but before we do that, could you take us through just in the fixed wireless access category, is LTE 4G still relevant as well, or are we just waiting on 5G?
No, absolutely. It's definitely relevant. I mean, we've been providing fixed wireless solutions as either primary or backup since 2015.
Hmm.
So as long as the local performance is there and it meets the need,
Right.
then absolutely LTE, LTE plus, 4G solutions are really relevant.
Hmm.
And I think they'll become even more relevant over time. So
Right.
look, consumers are going to be migrated onto 5G. They're being migrated at the moment. It's a process that will take some time because handsets need to be upgraded. Obviously, carriers are installing and upgrading their networks to 5G.
Hmm.
But once that happens, that 4G spectrum is not going away. That's not going to be
Hmm.
that's not going to be dismantled because
Right.
you need the ability to go back to that. So one of the issues that we have with 4G and around the way in which it was built is that it suffers from saturation.
Mm-hmm.
So, but if you take that consumer traffic off that network, then it becomes really interesting,
I
and it
see. So
becomes
LTE will be more enterprise worthy once
it
the
could well
consumers have
be.
moved to 5G.
Absolutely. I mean,
Interesting. Yeah.
it depends where you
Sure.
are, right?
Sure. Yeah.
LTE in the States sucks.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah. Yeah.
right. It does.
Yeah.
And so everybody's waiting for 5G.
Right.
But in Europe, those LTE networks are powerful. They're strong. I
Mhm.
mean, I have an LTE router in my house. I get over 200 meg down and 70
Wow.
meg up, right?
Wow.
With a
Yeah.
latency of
Hmm.
around 55, 60 milliseconds. So
Hmm.
that's a usable broadband
Right.
alternative
Absolutely.
for retail outlets. So
Absolutely. Yeah.
absolutely, so it can be used, and I
Hmm.
think it's really about looking at cellular networks, so fixed wireless, but cellular networks, and defining and using opportunities that we have with the performance of those networks to deliver services for customers in a dynamic and disruptive and flexible way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'm not a big wireless expert. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's been my understanding that one of the sort of developmental delays to 5G has been that the tower density the towers have to be a lot more dense, I should say, right? So because the signal doesn't go as far, it doesn't penetrate well, you need a mesh network and all that. Is that being overcome by the carriers so that 5G fixed wireless is becoming more available to the consumer?
I mean, what we're seeing network performance increase, which is what you would expect. So as investment plans roll out, as that density, as you say, as that density increases, then we're seeing performance increase. What we're also seeing is we're seeing a lot of rebadging, right? It's very easy to change your 4G network to a 5G network.
Right.
All the operator needs to do is to push a new APN. But those operators that are making the investments, I mean, if we talk about the US, for example, what we're seeing certainly, T-Mobile and Verizon are certainly putting in the investment, and you can see that in the network performance that we're picking up with some of the testing that we're doing, and I guess we'll talk about that
absolutely
in a bit. And the network that isn't putting that investment in, AT&T, we're seeing that, right? We're seeing that their performance is significantly different to the other two. So it's all based on the amount of investment that those carriers are putting in.
But that's an interesting point, that you're saying there's some sort of 5G washing out there, that it's not just about the radio signal or whatever.
It's across the world.
Right.
Right. Across the world, Greg. We're seeing that. And, carriers are, from a marketing perspective, are wanting to say that 5G services are available. And so they're pushing that out, that 5G is available. Actually, in the testing that we're doing, we're understanding whether that is true 5G or whether it's actually 4G. And so really we're seeing badged 5G connections actually being 4G. And I think that's, I understand why that's happening.
Sure.
What you just need to do is you need a partner. You need to be able to understand the true performance of those networks in order to be able to deliver the service and capitalize on this different way of accessing networks.
Right. Absolutely. All right. So let's say I'm an enterprise and I want a secondary or tertiary connection, say, or whatever the case may be, have difficult sites, or just around the world, want to be able to add some flexibility. What does it take me through the process of getting a network set up on fixed wireless access?
So the key thing is to do your homework. Okay. So that's number one. You need to understand what networks are available in those locations and what is the performance of those networks. So the way that we go about it and what we're trying to promote as I think industry standards is to actually go out there and understand the RF environment. Right. And that means using tools to assess which carriers are available in those areas, what technologies are available in those areas, and then present solutions to customers that allow them to take advantage of those networks. So that's number one. Number two is implementation is really important. The second element is implementation. So you need to be able to implement this. There are a bunch of companies out there around the world, and they'll stick a multi-MZ. So multi-MZ is a multi-carrier SIM into a router. They'll send it out to the customer and tell the customer to plug it in. That isn't going to work. It doesn't matter how good the RF environment is. If you can't install this equipment correctly, you're not going to get the performance that you're looking for, and therefore it's going to be a disappointing result. So really, it's those two things. It's understanding the environment, doing surveys. You can do them quite effectively, and then it sits around implementation. Right. And then the third element, which actually is something that I think ties into telegeography, is it's all about the plumbing. Right. So you need the right carrier partners to be able to deliver the services. So if you've got an IoT SIM from a carrier, that may not work. Networks work based on plumbing. You need to think about the use case. You need to think about where that traffic needs to be broken out. And a lot of these IoT products that are out there at the moment have only got 2 POPs in the world. So I was talking to a global carrier 6-9 months ago. They want to sell us their global roaming SIM. It has a breakout in Singapore and there's a breakout in Amsterdam. Well, if I'm deploying that in the United States, then I'm adding 230 milliseconds
Much less Sao Paulo or something like that.
Absolutely. So
uh,
that's the third layer. So the third layer is making sure you've got the right carrier partner that's going to deliver that breakout
mhm.
where you need it.
Yeah.
And so once you put all those things together, then you get a pretty good picture, and that's what we do.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a brilliant point that obviously we love thinking about at telegeography is that thinking on as the enterprise wants to these days more of an application basis than a pure network basis, that it's so important to understand where your traffic is destined and the paths that it needs to take to get there. So I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so since we're talking about geography, Toby, let's get more into geography. Obviously, behind me is one of our telegeography maps of submarine cable
Yeah,
infrastructure. I've looked at some of your maps of 5G and wireless infrastructure, and I think it's really cool. I love what you guys are doing. Can you tell us
thank
about
you.
Cellsmart's mapping project?
So yeah, it really came out of really answering your last question, which
Hmm.
is what is the performance of these cellular networks? And what we wanted to do is we wanted to understand the true performance of those networks. We
Right.
wanted to not just take what the carrier was saying was the performance of their network. We weren't looking at what the technology said was capable. We wanted to really understand.
Hmm.
Um, that performance. So we created our global cellular performance survey, and we started, with 2,500 tests. We've now done 110,780 tests in 72 countries.
Wow.
We've got we've undertaken those tests in over 81,000 unique locations around the world. And what that does is that gives us a unique insight into the performance of those networks. And we've refined our testing methodology. So we started by using a crowdsourced methodology, and but now what we've moved into is a true comparative testing methodology. So we have a
Mm.
rig
Hmm.
which sits on top of a vehicle, and that's undertaking a series of tests from a speed and performance point of view every 60 seconds.
Right.
So we're running a speed test every 60 seconds. We're understanding what the download speed is, what the upload speed is, what the latency and what the jitter is
Hmm.
comparatively. So up to
Right.
4 carriers at the same time. And then every half second, we're pulling RF information.
Hmm.
So we're understanding what the RSSI is. We're understanding what the SNIR is, the RSRP, the RSRQ, so that we can understand and then overlay in a 3D environment, if you like, what does the RF look like, and then how does that answer the question about performance?
I see. So it's sort of looking at how strong is the radio signal, if you will, and then what is the performance in terms of standard measures like latency and bandwidth and
Correct.
things like that, and then you sort of overlay that onto the physical geography of a city, say.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we just finished the first half of a tour of the US, and really it's a benchmarking tour. It's not.
Not the
We need
final
to do a
answer,
lot more work. But
right?
we started in New York. We went down the East Coast as far as Jacksonville, on the Atlantic coast in Florida, across to Tallahassee, Mobile, Alabama, New Orleans, then Houston, Austin, all the way up to Dallas, Oklahoma City, Kansas, Chicago, Detroit, and then Pittsburgh, and back to New York,
Hmm.
testing carriers. So we were testing 4 carriers. We're testing 3 for the majority of the way, so the big 3 American carriers,
Right.
and then US Cellular as well, because we
Hmm.
were interested in them because they are a carrier in their own right. They've got their own heartland territory
Right.
in that sort of Midwest part of the states, just to see how it was going. And what we got was some really, really interesting results. So if you're looking at a broadband replacement, then the average speed that we were picking up over 20,000 tests, which is the number of tests that we did in this sort of first 2-week tranche of our
Hmm.
testing, the average speed is 83.82 down. The
Wow.
average
Yeah.
upload is
Hmm.
25.61.
Wow. That is pretty impressive, I have to say. Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
with a 65 millisecond latency. So
Hmm.
if you're looking at a replacement service for broadband,
Right.
then potentially those average results really play out. Where it gets really interesting is looking at the difference when you start getting into the metro areas.
Mm-hmm.
So when you actually start getting into those city centers, we're looking at maximum speeds of in excess of half a gig down. And upload speeds of nearly 150 meg, and latencies around, well, the lowest latency we recorded was 12.45 milliseconds.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where we're beginning to see the performance of of 5G coming into play, and delivering the potential to support sophisticated services for large numbers of people. So not just not just your fast food franchise or your retail outlet or your branch office, but actually with these type of speeds, then we're looking at being able to provide certainly decent secondary or tertiary backup to larger sites.
Yeah, I think that's really, really interesting because, certainly, as I said at the start, when we're talking to enterprises about this, do you use wireless in what situations? A pretty standard use case would be, a more remote site, somewhere where it's hard or impossible to get to wireline providers. But when you're talking about these kinds of bandwidths being available in the city center, then suddenly the use case shifts, I think, to that, like, fast provisioning, flexibility, maybe even sort of some on-demand services, or even just as a permanent sort of wireline replacement, because the throughput is good enough, and it's sometimes even in a multi-tenant office building, it's sometimes hard to get truly competitive pricing on the local tail there. So yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it allows you freedom, and you're right. I mean, particularly in certain countries in the world, particularly the US, where you're tied into a provider that's a wireline provider, but you have the ability to procure services from a wireless provider. Then it becomes it gives you the ability to be freer. And actually, if you implement these services correctly, then if you use the right antennas, if you put them in the right location, if you have the right structured cabling that brings that connectivity down to where you need it to be in a building, then you really do have a viable alternative that potentially is going to give you the performance that you're looking for.
Right. Now, Toby, I usually ask this kind of question right at the end of the show, but in this case, I think a lot of people listening are probably really interested to see this map. How do they find the map and start using it?
Sure. So there's some of the data that we make publicly available, and there's some data that obviously we keep and we talk to our customers about. But if you want to look at just the density of tests that we've done, then if you go to HTTPS and then survey.smartcic.map, then you'll get our heat map, and that shows exactly where we've been. And then if you replace that map / with test drive, then you get access to the data that the top line data that we have for performance, and you'll see there are, and I'll send you the links, Greg. So
I'll put them in the show notes. Absolutely.
But then you can drill down into that data, and we're more than happy for people to drill into that data and understand, and then ask us questions, and we'll come and talk to them about what we're really finding.
And then if we're at the next level, so you have a customer service provider, or perhaps even a large enterprise doing a lot of their own sourcing, how do they interact with this data? How do they use it in that process of kind of setting up service?
So there's a couple of things that we can do. So firstly, we will build custom reports in this, I guess, the similar way that telegeography does.
Absolutely, yeah.
We'll build custom reports around a use case that they're looking for, and we'll deliver that to them. But what we can also do as well is we can undertake collection for them. So we can actually go out and survey. So the way in which we've developed our testing methodology is that we get the results back almost in real time. So if we have customers with specific locations, then we'll drive by those locations and pull that data and feed that back to them in hours, so they can really understand. So we're feeding back radio frequency, we're feeding back that data, and we're feeding back the performance data. based on the mix of carriers that they're interested in us testing, and we're completely agnostic.
Right.
So if somebody wants, we're testing for our own purposes, we're testing at MNOs. But for example, if you wanted to test a bunch of MVNOs, then we can stick those SIMs in there and we can contrast the performance of the MVNO to the MNO, particularly if you know which network that they're using.
Right.
And then you can see how that plays out.
And I'm just curious, do you see a big difference there? Because as an MVNO, they would say, well, it's the same service, right? So
we haven't done that testing yet. And actually I would certainly like to get there. So we're baselining with MNOs at the moment in the States. So once we've done that, our testing plans,
then you'll have the comparator, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've finished sort of the central and east coast. We're going to be hitting the west coast week commencing the 13th of November.
Okay, coming up. So we're recording this in early November. I think it'll be out pretty soon. So it's look for it to come out. Yeah.
So we're starting in Arizona on the 13th. We're going to Vegas. We're going to Boise in Idaho, and then we're going down the west coast all the way to San Diego. So I think that then we'll create that baseline picture of the states, and then we can start drilling down into that data. And I think we'll pull up some really interesting stuff. And then we're looking at beyond 2023 now into our 2024 planning. And that is, there's a big hole. So, I'm interested in Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado. I'm interested in the big bits in the middle of the states towards the rest, where there's not a lot of there's not a lot of habitation. This is where fixed wireless can really play a difference because it's going to take a while, even though I think today the government announced an $18 point something trillion aid package to try and get wireline services into rural areas in the States. It's going to take time for that to happen. And so it's going to be a lot easier for carriers to put a pipe to a tower than it is to be able to deliver those services. So if we can start mapping those areas and understanding, then I think that will be really interesting. And we've got use cases where it works. So we did something in the Australian outback for an enterprise customer. The nearest cell tower was 17 kilometers away.
Wow, yeah.
But with the right antennas, the right carrier, we delivered 70 meg down, 40 meg up.
Wow, that's incredible.
On 4G.
Yeah.
So it does work. Again, it plays that earlier point around implementation, doing your homework and implementing it. So it'll be really interesting to pick that stuff up when we start mapping there next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to see the results. Something that I just end up talking about all the time, of course, is just the economics of telecom service. And, it is really expensive and difficult to dig trenches, to put ducts in the ground, to even to hang wires on poles. In fact, I did a whole episode on this with an ILEC in the US about just all of the layers that you have to go through of licenses and permissions or whatever just to hang a wire on an existing pole, let alone build new poles and all this, right? So there does seem to be the opportunity for a lot of disruption here with those kinds of bandwidths, when all you need to do is get fiber to a tower rather than fiber to all of the little streams that would come out of that on a wireline service. So
yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where this type of service is really going to help with broadband in rural places. And I think as those services grow, as the capacities of those networks expand, then that's where the use case is going to be. And the focus of our research is really about enterprise use case. And so if you think of all those rural businesses that are trying to run their operations on damp pieces of string that are falling to pieces, and having something that's going to deliver you even the sort of average speeds we were talking about, 83 meg down, 25 meg up.
That'd be a huge improvement.
That's going to make a huge difference to the way in which they operate on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds kind of sort of more far-reaching, almost like nonprofit oriented. But there's a lot of economic development capabilities that come with having more bandwidth available to a lot of these places, and especially in the world we live in now, where folks work from anywhere all the time, right?
Yeah.
And even to an extent, there's been a lot of migration out of the coastal areas to these like exact states that you're talking about, and I think this certainly seems to me to provide the promise that we can keep that working, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah.
And we're interested in Africa as well and other
Hmm.
developing, markets, because if you look at the amount of data center investment that's going into Africa at the
Right.
moment, and how and so what are the services that are going to that they're going to utilize
Hmm.
uh, all of that capacity? Well, they're not necessarily going to be wireline services.
Right.
In the same way that a lot of African countries skip the whole PSTN network
Right.
infrastructure piece, they're going to do exactly the same thing. They've got an infrastructure there, and they're going to be able to use cellular services, whether it's 4G, whether it's 5G, to deliver real opportunities for communities to become connected. And
Hmm.
I was talking to somebody the other day about internet connectivity and that whole debate about at what point does it become a human right.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so what sort of services need to be available in order for people to access social security,
Right.
medical information, all of those sort of things. And so I'm really interested to continue that project, to sort of map this stuff out and begin to make some assessment about when those networks are going to be capable of delivering those type of services,
Yeah, well,
particularly
especially
things
with
like.
there's an extent to which the terrestrial radio, terrestrial television are dying, right?
Mhm.
In the younger generations don't own the devices that would pick up an FM radio
Yeah,
signal, right?
absolutely.
So just like that was a sort of public good in that sense, I think that it's easy to argue that internet access should be as well, So
Yeah, I agree.
and this is another pet peeve of mine, Toby. So I'm sorry if this is too much of a distraction, but it's
Don't
also
worry.
something that I think about a lot in terms of the spectrum that's available for mobile service, right? Do you see the world changing in that sense of like, hey, maybe terrestrial radio, even television, one day turned down? Is that spectrum valuable from the mobile provider side? You think?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it speaks to your point about the population's access to services based on different frequencies. People
Hmm.
don't have radios anymore. People
Right.
don't have terrestrial TV anymore. And I think we'll see those spectrums being used by carriers, or by governments. I
Hmm.
think in
Hmm.
order to deliver those type of services. And I think that is the future. There
Right.
will come a point where everybody has, I think, a handheld device, and that will allow you access to a walled garden of content that
Hmm.
might be it might be the governmental services that you need to access, the social services, it might be some entertainment and so on. And then effectively it will be a pay-per-view type thing. That's definitely, in my view, how things are going to unfold.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. All right, so Toby, before we totally wrap up, you've touched
Sure.
on a bunch of different use cases, but I wonder if you could, without naming names or anything like that, maybe give us like a solid like here's enterprise XYZ or whatever, and this is what they would be looking to either through their service provider or directly. This is what they would be looking to Cellsmart to sort of accomplish.
Sure, absolutely. We're great use case. Petrochemical provider, one of the largest petrochemical companies in the world, had a bunch of gas stations
Mm,
that they needed to connect to an SD-WAN overlay service.
mm-hmm,
And we went in and we delivered 400 of those sites on fixed wireless access, because the vast majority of those sites were not going to be able to receive the wireline capacity, wireline performance services that they needed to drive the SD-WAN solution.
mm-hmm.
So we went in. 60% of those sites, Greg, are staying on fixed wireless access because they
Wow.
provide the bandwidth. And that's the
Right.
use case, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it worked. Our customer, who's a global telco, was able to roll that service out. They were able to roll it out really quickly. And the end customer didn't need to buy the wireline solution.
Right.
Another use case, we have a global, one of the largest car manufacturers in the world,
Hmm.
wanted to understand in 23 locations around the world, wanted to understand what the RF environment was so that they could use cellular connectivity as a backup. So they had an MPLS, they had DIA, it was SD-WAN, but there's no point in bringing in cellular connectivity that wasn't going to be able to drive any of the functionality should the first two go down. So
Hmm.
we went in, we surveyed, provided complete agnostic, carrier agnostic, technology agnostic solution for them to be able to pick the right provider in each of those locations. And we're talking about large, truck assembly plants, large
Hmm.
warehouses. This is not branch offices and car showrooms. So that they're able to deliver that,
Right.
so that they have a fully robust, redundant connectivity solution.
I think that brings up a really great point of the power of doing this kind of work in looking at, rather than sort of having to set up a contract of like, here's all my sites and this provider does them. You look at what's the best provider, what's the best performance for at each of those locations, then get a contract in place for those and be able to manage it all through the service provider. I think that is to
Absolutely.
me what looks like the future of networks, where sort of what I'm really looking at is what's the whole ecosystem look like, and what's the best way for me to get my service across that entire ecosystem.
Yeah, and that's what we do. We say that we are carrier agnostic, technology agnostic. So
Hmm.
absolutely, you contract with us, and we'll deliver a service based on a series of metrics that we agree that are based generally around use case and performance.
Right.
And then we'll select the carriers that are going to deliver that
Hmm.
service.
And it might
We'll
be
make sure that the
LTE over here
plumbing is
from this
right.
carrier and 5G over here from that carrier. And yeah.
Absolutely, and we'll plug it all together
Hmm.
so that it works.
That is what everyone is looking for, is to not get
Absolutely,
phone calls, right?
it
I want
is.
it to work all the time. Excellent. Yeah, that's really helpful. All right, so Toby, I want to close this out with something we've touched on already, but certainly
Sure.
some of this bears repeating, but it would get a little more in depth on just the future of the fixed wireless market in general. With 5G coming along, what do you see that maybe enterprises aren't thinking about now and should be thinking about in the next couple of years in terms of adopting this? And then what's your long-term vision for really, I want to talk about the role that fixed wireless plays in the sort of general enterprise connectivity market, if that makes sense.
Okay. I mean, the size of the market's interesting. I think it's about 29 billion at the moment, and it's
Hmm.
suggesting that certain players are suggesting that it will increase to about 150 billion by 2028. So it's definitely a rapidly
Yeah.
growing market, and there's a huge potential there. I think what we're beginning to see with the research is that we're beginning to see the promise of 5G connectivity. What
Hmm.
I mean by that is we're seeing results that are coming in that are where we're having 1.3 gig down, where we're seeing 150 meg up and sub 10 millisecond latencies. Now
Hmm.
that's really interesting because that's where use case begins to expand
Right.
beyond broadband replacement into potentially looking at, okay, so at what point does this become a contender, or
Right.
does it become a decision making element when you're looking at DIA?
Hmm.
So, and if you can deliver those services as quickly as we can now, then that allows bigger businesses to become more dynamic, to become more disruptive, potentially save money. They're not going to be necessarily tied into the same sort of contracts that they are before. This could be a very disruptive
Hmm.
technology. It can deliver power to enterprise and equally to telcos. So telcos can take, if they want to, can either choose to take advantage of this. And obviously, T-Mobile, I think, right, they've
Right.
ditched their wireline business.
Right.
They're a wireless company.
Hmm.
So they've gone down that route. So they're embracing that technology. And I think if you're a telco, you've got to be looking at your wireless as being part of your playbook. And then you've got to look at how do you use wireless to connect to your fixed infrastructure? Okay, so what we say to our customers is, well, effectively, you can be on there everywhere. So you can then, with that type of performance, you can connect anywhere to a node on a network.
Right.
And that's where it becomes interesting. So I think we'll see new products coming out from telcos that are using wireless as last mile, prioritized over the network. We'll begin to see more enterprise type wireless solutions with traffic prioritization, different data packages that are going to allow larger enterprise organizations to take advantage of this. And then if you put that together, it becomes pretty dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I've been hearing sort of enterprises wanting this world for a few years now, and I think it looks like it is starting to emerge. So I think the demand is there, and especially as you say, once the capabilities are up to a sort of wireline DIA sort of competitor, I think that's going to be a game changer. So it is a space that I will be watching closely, no doubt. Yeah, absolutely.
Next 18 months, I think you'll see that ramp up over 18 months, definitely.
Yeah, and I also like the point you made about carriers thinking about how does this connect into my sort of larger network. There's almost some rethinking of the topology of the network in general that this facilitates.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. So Toby, you already mentioned where we find the maps, but in general, how can listeners keep up with you and what you're doing at SmartCIC?
So look at LinkedIn. We have Cellsmart on LinkedIn, so there's a separate dedicated page. So please become a follower. That's a great place to learn about our updates. And obviously SmartCIC Global Services on LinkedIn as well, and smartcic.com. And I'm generally around a lot of industry events, so come and hunt me down, and I'm more than happy to sit and have a conversation with anybody.
Yeah, excellent. I hope we can run into each other sometime, and I think maybe this is worth a check-in in those 18 months maybe, and see how things developed, and especially once this mapping is robust and whatnot. I would be fascinated to get a look at it in depth.
Yeah, I'd love to share it.
Excellent. Well, Toby, this was really fun and informative for me, which is always my goal. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me on, Greg. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.